The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the lights above. It wasn't the kind of silence that makes you restless. It was the kind that presses down, heavy, like a secret that has waited too long to be spoken aloud. Keanu Reeves sat in a chair, dressed simply as he often was. A black suit jacket, slightly worn at the edges, and a dark shirt beneath, open at the collar. His hair, longer now and streaked with silver, framed a face that carried decades of quiet endurance. His eyes, dark and searching, avoided the camera for a moment, as if gathering the courage to pull words from a place he had locked away for years. The interviewer leaned forward, waiting, sensing that something rare was about to happen. For a man who had built his life on silence, humility, and privacy, this moment felt monumental. And then, in a low, measured voice, Keanu said the words that stopped the world in its tracks. "She was the love of my life." Those 7 words, simple yet heavy with emotion, carried more weight than any performance he had ever given on screen. They were not lines written for him. They were not part of a script, polished and rehearsed. They were his truth. And for Keanu Reeves, a man adored by millions for his stoic kindness and quiet grace, it was a truth he had never before spoken aloud in such a raw, unguarded way. In that instant, the room seemed to shrink, pulling the audience closer, as though the whole world leaned in to hear the secret he had finally chosen to share. His eyes glistened, not with theatrical flourish, but with the kind of restrained pain that only time can both soften and deepen. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a confession of love. But to those who knew his story, it was also a confession of loss, of grief, of a wound that never truly healed. The interviewer, stunned, did not immediately reply. The pause that followed was almost reverent, as if they too understood that pressing for details too soon would be a kind of intrusion. Keanu, however, did not retreat from his statement. Instead, he sat still, letting the silence fill the space between them. His fingers tapped gently against the armrest, a small rhythm betraying the storm beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't a man seeking sympathy or attention. This was a man who had carried a love story within him for decades, too sacred to share, too fragile to expose, until now. It was as though every sacrifice, every moment of solitude, every quiet act of kindness he had given the world had been built on the foundation of this unspoken truth. And at last, the truth had surfaced. For the audience watching, there was a sudden realization. The Keanu Reeves they thought they knew, the action hero, the internet's wholesome king, the actor who gave up his subway seat without hesitation, the man who lived simply despite his wealth, was also a man who had loved deeply and lost deeply. And that love, unforgotten, had shaped the very person he had become. His confession was not simply about her. It was about how she had remained with him, a quiet presence woven into every choice he made, every kindness he offered, every refusal to give in to the excess and vanity of Hollywood. By saying, "She was the love of my life," Keanu was not just honoring her memory, he was revealing the hidden thread that explained the man he was. In that first scene, the world did not see a celebrity giving an interview. They saw a man who had carried a love story like a flame in the darkness, refusing to let it die. They saw the vulnerability beneath the stoicism, the grief behind a smile, the human truth behind a legend. And for the first time, Keanu Reeves was not just the quiet star of Hollywood. He was a man in love, a man in mourning, and a man brave enough, after decades of silence, to finally confess what his heart had always known. The 1990s were a whirlwind for Keanu Reeves. His star was rising with a force few could have predicted. Speed had catapulted him into global fame. Point Break made him a cult icon, and whispers about the upcoming Matrix were already stirring Hollywood. Yet behind the flashbulbs, the late-night sets, and the endless interviews, there was something quieter happening, something that no headline could capture. It wasn't a movie deal or a new role. It was a feeling, a connection, something real. And it began not in front of cameras, but in the still, unguarded moments of life. He had met her at a time when he needed grounding, when the chaos of fame threatened to swallow him whole. She wasn't dazzled by the glitter of Hollywood. She didn't care about premieres, scripts, or the pressure of being next to a rising star. Instead, she cared about him, the man, not the actor. For Keanu, who had always walked the fine line between visibility and invisibility, this was disarming. For the first time in a long time, someone saw beyond the screen. Their early days together were marked by simplicity. The kind of simplicity that becomes a refuge when the rest of your world is spinning too fast. They would go on long drives through Los Angeles at night, windows rolled down, music humming low, the city lights flickering past like distant stars. Keanu, who was never one for grand declarations or dramatic gestures, found joy in the quiet. Her laughter filling the car, her head resting lightly against his shoulder, the easy comfort of silence between them. He didn't have to perform here. He didn't have to hide. With her, he was not Keanu Reeves, Hollywood star. He was just Keanu, a man who loved motorcycles, music, and the gentle sound of rain against a window. She gave him what no studio contract or fan adoration could: peace. And in that peace, love grew. Friends who were close to them at the time would later describe their bond as rare, almost fragile in its tenderness. They weren't the kind of couple who flaunted their affection in public, nor did they chase the spotlight together. Their love was not for show, it was for them, and them alone. They shared books, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, and dreams about the future that seemed so possible then. Keanu, who had often felt like an outsider even in the middle of fame, found in her a kindred spirit. She believed in him when he doubted himself, and she grounded him when the world tried to lift him too high. It was, in every sense, the beginning of something rare, a love untouched by vanity, a love that thrived in its own quiet corner. For Keanu, these were the golden days. He had spent much of his life chasing roles, traveling, and enduring the loneliness that so often shadows success. But now, for the first time, he had a home, not a place, but a person. With her, he imagined a life beyond Hollywood, a family, a future where the constant noise of cameras and red carpets could be replaced by simpler joys. Mornings with coffee, evenings filled with music, and the comfort of knowing he would never have to face the darkness alone again. It was this vision, fragile and yet full of hope, that became the anchor for his life during those years. The love they shared was not just a chapter, it was the story he wished could last forever. Looking back now, decades later, it is clear why Keanu's voice trembled when he finally confessed, "She was the love of my life." Because in those days, before tragedy would rewrite the script of his existence, she truly was. She was the light that softened the shadows, the voice that quieted the noise, the heartbeat that reminded him he was human in a world that so often treated him like something else. It was the beginning of love, yes, but for Keanu, it was also the beginning of becoming the man we would one day see. Humble, compassionate, and deeply aware of the fleeting nature of happiness. In her love, he had found his truest self, and it is that memory, that sacred beginning, that has lingered with him ever since. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. For Keanu Reeves, that line was drawn in tragedy. One day he was living in the warmth of love and anticipation of a shared future. The next, the world he had been carefully building crumbled beneath his feet. News of the loss spread quietly at first, tucked away in the corners of tabloids. But for Keanu, it was not a headline, it was his heart breaking in real time. The woman who had given him hope, laughter, and the vision of a family was gone. Just like that, the golden days were over, replaced with an emptiness that would shadow his steps for decades. He didn't cry for the cameras, nor did he parade his grief in front of strangers. He carried it the way he carried everything else, quietly, almost invisibly. But inside, he was shattered. Friends close to him would later describe how the light in his eyes dimmed. He became quieter than usual, retreating into himself in ways that even those who knew him well could not reach. Hollywood kept moving, as it always does. Movies released, premieres rolled on, scripts demanded his attention. But for Keanu, none of it mattered. Fame has no antidote for grief, and money has no cure for the ache of losing someone who was meant to be your forever. At night, when the city around him roared with parties and glamour, he would sit alone, staring into the quiet, remembering her laughter, her touch, the plans they had made. The silence of her absence was louder than any applause he would ever receive. The unthinkable loss did more than break his heart, it altered the very foundation of who he was. He became a man of solitude, someone who learned to live without expecting permanence. Where others chased fortune and extravagance, Keanu stripped his life down to essentials, as though material things no longer carried weight. He rode his motorcycles alone through the streets of Los Angeles, long rides that took him into the night, the wind carrying away the tears he refused to shed in public. The press sometimes snapped photos of him sitting on park benches, alone, lost in thought. To the world, it became a meme, sad Keanu. But to him, it was not sadness for attention. It was grief, still lingering, still alive, still as sharp as the day it first struck. Yet, in the middle of this sorrow, there was also a quiet resilience. Keanu did not allow grief to turn him bitter or cold. Instead, he carried it like a scar, invisible but ever-present, a reminder of both love and loss. He spoke rarely about her, but when he did, his words carried a weight that silenced anyone who listened. There was no bitterness, no anger, only reverence. She remained with him, not in photographs or interviews, but in the choices he made, in the kindness he showed strangers, in the humility with which he lived. In losing her, he had been reminded of life's fragility, and rather than turn away from the world, he leaned into compassion. He knew firsthand how fleeting joy could be, and so he gave quietly to others, offering them the light he had lost. For the world, the story of Keanu Reeves is one of fame, resilience, and unexpected kindness. But beneath it all lies this truth. He loved once, deeply and wholly, and he lost that love in the cruelest of ways. It was the unthinkable loss that shaped him, not just as a man, but as the legend he became. When he confessed, decades later, that she was the love of his life, the world finally understood. His solitude was not emptiness. His humility was not a performance. His quiet kindness was not an accident. It was grief, transformed into grace. It was love, carried forward long after the person was gone. It was Keanu, living with a wound that never healed, yet refusing to let it make him anything less than human. After the loss, time didn't move forward for Keanu the way it did for others. To the world, years were marked by films, premieres, and box office records. For him, the years were measured by the silence that followed her absence. Hollywood saw him smile for cameras, deliver performances with quiet intensity, and walk red carpets with understated grace. But off-screen, Keanu's life was lived in shadows of solitude. He became a man defined not by what he said, but by what he chose not to say. In interviews, he answered questions politely but rarely revealed the depth of his personal world. When reporters probed about relationships, family, or happiness, he would smile faintly, lower his gaze, and deflect with gentle honesty, "I'm just trying to live." To those listening, it sounded vague, but for him, it was the only truth he could give. Silence, however, did not mean emptiness. In the years that followed, Keanu found refuge in small, ordinary acts. He walked the streets of New York and Los Angeles unnoticed, blending into the crowd with a baseball cap pulled low. He bought coffee alone, sometimes sitting outside the cafe, watching people pass by, quietly content to be part of the world without demanding anything from it. He gave his subway seat to strangers, held doors open, tipped generously, and offered kindness with no desire for recognition. These were not grand gestures designed to craft an image. They were simply who he was, a man who understood how fragile life could be, and who found purpose in offering slivers of light to others, even as he carried his own darkness. His work in film became both an escape and a reflection of his inner life. Roles like Neo in The Matrix and John Wick spoke to something deeper within him. A man searching for meaning, a man haunted by loss, a man fighting to endure. Audiences loved the action, the spectacle, the iconic lines. But for Keanu, each role was layered with his own quiet truth. Behind every performance was a man who had lost something irreplaceable. And though he rarely spoke about it, viewers felt it. They sensed the authenticity in his eyes, the way grief and resilience coexisted in his presence. Keanu Reeves didn't just play characters, he poured into them the unspoken weight of his own life. That, perhaps more than any script, is what made him unforgettable. In the silence of those decades, Keanu also cultivated a philosophy that set him apart from nearly everyone in Hollywood. He did not chase success. He didn't fill his mansion with extravagance, nor did he parade luxury cars or parties for attention. Instead, he chose modesty, giving away millions quietly to crew members, charities, and causes he believed in. When asked why he lived so simply, his answer was disarmingly direct. "Money is the last thing I think about. I could live on what I've already made for centuries." It wasn't detachment, it was clarity. When you've lost what matters most, you realize how little the rest truly means. His silence, then, was not a void. It was a lesson, a way of being. He carried his grief with dignity, and in doing so, he gave the world a new definition of strength. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that endures quietly, day after day. For decades, Keanu Reeves lived this way, present but private, successful yet humble, loved by millions yet profoundly alone. The silence became part of his identity, a protective shield around the most fragile parts of his soul. But it was never cold silence. It was warm, human, and filled with quiet acts of kindness that rippled through the world, often unnoticed. By refusing to speak openly about his loss, he allowed the love he once had to remain pure, untouched by gossip or sensationalism. And in that silence, she lived on, not as a tragedy, not as a headline, but as the love of his life, carried with him always. The room was small, intimate, and softly lit, as if designed not for spectacle but for truth. Cameras hummed quietly in the background, but for Keanu Reeves, they were invisible. He had sat in countless interviews over the decades, press junkets, late-night talk shows, red carpet questions, but this was different. This was not about promoting a film or answering scripted curiosities. This was about him. And perhaps for the first time in his long career, he allowed himself to peel back the curtain and reveal the heart he had guarded so fiercely. The interviewer asked him a question, simple, almost ordinary, about whether he had ever experienced a love so profound it changed his life. For a brief moment, Keanu's lips curled into a faint smile, a smile that seemed to hold both joy and sorrow. He paused, the silence stretching, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the room. Then, with a voice low but steady, he finally said the words, "She was the love of my life." The air seemed to shift. The interviewer leaned forward slightly, recognizing the gravity of the moment, but careful not to intrude. It wasn't just an answer, it was a confession, decades in the making. For years, the world had speculated about Keanu's private life, spinning stories and whispers, but he had never given them fuel. Now, in a single sentence, he gave them more than they had ever expected. Not gossip, but truth. His tone was not bitter, nor was it performative. It was reverent, tender, and heavy with memory. He spoke of her not as a past he had tried to escape, but as a presence that still lived within him. His eyes glistened with restrained tears, but he didn't look away. He wanted the world to understand. Not for him, not for sympathy, but for her. She deserved to be remembered not as a footnote, but as the love that defined him. As he continued, his words painted a picture of devotion that transcended time. He described how her laughter had carried him through long days, how her support had made him believe in himself when he doubted, how her presence had given him peace in a world built on chaos. He admitted that losing her had been the most devastating moment of his life, a wound that had never healed, but also the very thing that had shaped him into the man he was. "I wouldn't be who I am without her," he said softly. "Everything I do, every choice I make, in some way, goes back to her. She taught me what love really is, and I've carried that with me ever since." The audience watching knew this was no movie line. It was a man, finally allowing himself to grieve openly, to love openly, to confess openly. For decades, Keanu Reeves had lived in silence, letting his actions speak louder than words. His kindness, his humility, his refusal to be consumed by fame, all of it had been rooted in this silent devotion. And now, by breaking that silence, he revealed the truth behind the legend. He wasn't just a beloved actor. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost profoundly, yet had chosen to honor that love not with bitterness, but with grace. His confession was not about reopening old wounds. It was about acknowledging that even in loss, love remains. "People think time heals," he said quietly, "but the truth is, you just learn to live with it. And sometimes, living with it is a way of keeping them with you." In that moment, the millions who admired him saw him not as an untouchable figure, but as one of them, human, vulnerable, and achingly real. When the interview ended, the room fell into silence again. Not the silence of grief this time, but of reverence. The confession had not been dramatic. It had not been theatrical. It had been simple, raw, and honest. And that honesty struck deeper than any performance could. As Keanu stood, thanked the interviewer, and walked away, he carried himself with the same quiet humility he always had. But now, the world knew what he had carried within him all these years. He had finally spoken it aloud. And in doing so, he ensured that the love of his life would never be forgotten, not as a tragedy, not as a headline, but as the sacred truth of a man who, after decades of silence, had the courage to confess.